On October 7, 1989, tens of thousands of people marched on the U.S. Capitol building in Washington, D.C. They gathered to hear Tracy Chapman talking about a revolution and Stevie Wonder call out for love and kindness. They gathered to be inspired by the words of Jesse Jackson, Susan Sarandon, Martin Sheen, Coretta Scott King, and the event's organizers from the National Coalition for the Homeless, the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, the Community for Creative Nonviolence, and the National Union of the Homeless. They gathered to stand in solidarity, those who were homeless themselves, along with their housed allies. They gathered to protest the severe lack of safe, decent, and affordable housing in the United States. October 7th was a sunny autumn day, and the flags surrounding the Washington Monument flapped in the breeze as marchers who had crossed the Potomac River from the Pentagon merged with a mass of people gathered at the monument. Others walked the nearly 4 miles from RFK Stadium, where they had been sheltered in the days leading up to the march. As they converged, the marchers made their way past the AIDS quilt laid out in rows on the National Mall, down Connecticut Avenue toward the Capitol. Some estimates put the number of protesters at 150,000. They came from the streets and the shelters, from churches, union halls, and school playgrounds. They came from kitchen tables and park benches where local organizing efforts were born. They came from Miami and Portland, Denver and Los Angeles. They came by the busload from Boston and Atlanta. More than 500 people came by bus from Chicago alone, and a group of 250 people walked to Washington from New York City, a trek of 16 days. Children from Dayton, Ohio pulled red wagons full of letters to Congress, pleading for action. And people came from the streets of the nation's capital itself, where they would sleep again that night, and the next, and the next. Together they had one simple demand: housing now for all Americans. Specifically, they wanted restoration of $24 billion in federal funding for affordable housing that had been slashed from the nation's budget under the Reagan administration. These cuts, along with the growing income and wealth gap, were widely understood to be a major driver of the dramatic rise in homelessness in the early 1980s. Many local marches prior to October 7th built momentum that culminated in the Housing Now March, which was and remains the largest collective outcry for housing as a basic human right in the nation's history. Building on previous advocacy victories, such as passage of the Stuart B. McKinney Homeless Assistance Act in 1987, the momentum galvanized by the Housing Now March led to additional victories, such as creation of the Cranston-Gonzalez National Affordable Housing Act in 1990. The march also coincided with a groundswell of activism. Local grassroots organizing flourished, and acts of civil disobedience occurred across the United States, including occupation of empty buildings, a coordinated multi-city Take Off the Boards campaign during the months leading up to the Housing Now March. Many of these efforts were led by people who were themselves homeless, and by the faith community, which has played a central role in responding to the homelessness crisis. While Housing Now was organized in response to the epidemic of contemporary homelessness in the United States, it is important to recognize that homelessness did not begin in the 1980s. In fact, historians such as Roberta Ann Johnson, Kenneth Kuzmer, Todd DiPastino, and others have documented waves of homelessness that go back to the earliest days of colonization. Over the centuries since it first appeared in the cities of the Eastern Seaboard, homelessness has impacted some more than others. Native Americans and African Americans, immigrants, veterans, people with disabilities, children and youth, and the elderly. Homelessness has spiked with each major economic recession and has receded as more humane policies have gone into effect, including veterans' benefits after the Civil War, Social Security for all Americans, Medicare and Medicaid, and a massive infusion of federal funding for affordable housing in the years following World War II. This combination of housing, healthcare access, and guaranteed income caused homelessness to recede, so that when the homelessness epidemic exploded in American cities in the 1980s, it felt new. Since then, millions of Americans have experienced firsthand the horrors of living without a home. Men, women, children, youth and young adults, veterans who fought for this country only to be failed by it when they returned from war, people suffering from mental illness and addiction, people fleeing domestic violence. In cities across the U.S., people of color, particularly Native Americans and African Americans, remain disproportionately overrepresented among the ranks of those experiencing homelessness. Homelessness is not new, it is not colorblind, and it is not inevitable. Homelessness can be shaped by changes in public policy and funding priorities, which can in turn be shaped by grassroots organizing and civil disobedience. As the United States continues to face homelessness on a massive scale well into the 21st century, it is important to ask what we can learn from the past, from our successes and our failures. First, community-based grassroots organizing is an essential catalyst for social change. Those in power never cede that power without well-organized, focused outside pressure. Political will is absolutely essential to create social change and to drive resources to solve homelessness, but it will never occur without strong, unified organizing. Second, those most affected by homelessness must be in decision-making roles around funding, policy, programming, and advocacy. Finally, we need a dramatic recommitment of resources at the national level to restore affordable housing to a level that allows every American to have a roof over their head. Such a commitment requires political will and a collective commitment to move beyond our society's complacency and acceptance of homelessness as inevitable. As we seek to learn from the past and chart a better course for the days ahead, we must rethink our current approach, recommit to grassroots organizing, and elevate the voices of people experiencing homelessness.